Pastor David Adeleke stood in his church office overlooking the sanctuary of Abundant Grace Ministries in Lekki, Lagos, holding the property documents his wife had just signed, documents that transferred ownership of her father's 15 plots of land in Aja, worth 250 million naira, from her name into the church's name, with him as sole trustee. And he smiled with satisfaction because this land would become the site of his new megachurch complex, the project that would elevate him from a pastor with 2,000 members to a nationally recognized man of God. And his wife, Sister Rebecca, sat across from him with tears streaming down her face, one hand clutching the small recording device hidden in her handbag that had captured every word of the 2-hour manipulation session he had just put her through, every scripture he had twisted, every guilt trip he had deployed, every threat he had made. And she looked at him with the eyes of a woman who had finally seen the truth about the man she married. And she said quietly, "It is done. The land is yours." And Pastor David said, "No, my love. The land is God's. We're just being obedient." And Rebecca nodded and stood to leave. And as she walked out of that office, she whispered a prayer, not for forgiveness, not for reconciliation, but for justice, for the strength to expose this man completely, for the courage to take back what he had stolen, not just from her, but from every person in that church who believed his lies. Where are you watching from? Lagos, Abuja, maybe Port Harcourt or London? Drop it in the comments, because this story will show you how a woman can appear weak while gathering evidence, how silence can be strategic, how sometimes the best revenge is not immediate confrontation but patient documentation, and how a man of God can be brought down not by rumors or accusations, but by his own recorded voice, admitting exactly what he did and why. 5 years before that moment in the church office, before the manipulation and the forced signing, Rebecca Okonkwo was a 29-year-old corporate lawyer working at one of Lagos's top law firms, earning excellent money, living in her own flat in Victoria Island. And she was sharp, independent, the kind of woman who had built her life carefully, deliberately, using the inheritance her late father had left her wisely. Her father, who had been a successful building contractor before he died of kidney failure when Rebecca was 25, leaving her and her 2 younger siblings 15 plots of land in Aja that he had bought when the area was still undeveloped, land that was now worth a fortune as Aja transformed into one of Lagos's fastest growing neighborhoods. And Rebecca's father had made her promise on his deathbed to never sell that land, to hold it for at least 10 years until the value multiplied, to use it to secure her future and her siblings' futures. And Rebecca had kept that promise, had held onto the land through numerous tempting offers, through financial pressures, through everything, because a promise to her dying father was sacred. Rebecca met David Adeleke at a legal conference where he was the keynote speaker. Not yet a senior pastor, just an associate pastor at a mid-sized Pentecostal church, but he was eloquent, educated, with a master's degree in theology, and he spoke about faith and success in ways that made even skeptical lawyers lean forward and listen. And when he approached Rebecca during the networking session, complimented her question during the Q&A, asked if they could discuss ministry and law over coffee, Rebecca felt drawn to him, drawn to his confidence, his vision, his apparent passion for God's work. And she said yes to coffee, then yes to dinner, then yes to a relationship. And 6 months later, she said yes to his marriage proposal because David seemed like everything she had prayed for. A man of God with ambition and education, someone who respected her career, someone who talked about partnership and building together, someone who cried real tears when she told him about her father's death and her promise about the land, and said he would never ask her to break a promise to her father. That kind of integrity was rare and beautiful. They married in a lavish wedding at his church. Rebecca wore a custom dress that cost 2 million naira. David wore a designer tuxedo. 1,000 guests attended, and Rebecca paid for most of it because David said his pastor's salary was modest and he didn't want to start their marriage in debt. So Rebecca used some of her savings, and she didn't mind because she loved him, believed in him, wanted their wedding to be memorable, and it was beautiful, perfect. Everyone said they were the ideal couple, the lawyer and the pastor, beauty and brains and faith all combined. And for the first year of marriage, Rebecca believed she had made the right choice. David was attentive and loving. He supported her career, prayed with her every morning, made her laugh, made her feel cherished. And when his senior pastor retired and the church board appointed David as the new senior pastor of Abundant Grace Ministries, Rebecca was thrilled, proud of her husband, excited about this new chapter, and she threw herself into being a supportive pastor's wife, leading women's ministry, organizing outreach programs, using her legal skills to help the church navigate contracts and agreements. And she did it all joyfully because she believed they were building God's kingdom together. But the moment David became senior pastor, something shifted. It was subtle at first, just small changes in his demeanor, the way he started talking about vision and expansion constantly, the way he began measuring everything by numbers and growth, the way he started spending money lavishly on his appearance, on a new car, on expensive suits, claiming that a senior pastor needed to look prosperous to attract the kind of members who could fund major projects. And Rebecca felt uneasy, but told herself he was just adjusting to new responsibilities, just finding his leadership style. And she tried to be understanding, tried to support his vision, even when it made her uncomfortable. Within 18 months of becoming senior pastor, David had grown Abundant Grace from 800 members to 2,500, and the offerings increased dramatically. And David started talking about building a new church facility, about how the current rented hall was limiting their growth, about how God had given him a vision of a massive complex with a 5,000-seat auditorium, offices, a media studio, a Bible college. And David became obsessed with this vision, talked about it constantly, preached about it every Sunday, called it the Canaan Project, and he pressured members to give sacrificially, to sow seed offerings, to believe God for miracles, and money poured in, millions of naira. But it wasn't enough. David said they needed land first, needed a strategic location, and he started looking at properties in Lekki and Ajah. And that's when he began mentioning Rebecca's land. Casually at first, just comments like, "Your father's land in Ajah would be perfect for a church. Imagine the kingdom impact." And Rebecca would laugh it off and say, "That land is my inheritance. It's not for sale." And David would nod and say, of course, I'm just thinking out loud." But the comments became more frequent, more pointed, and Rebecca started feeling pressured. started feeling like David was building up to something. 6 months into the Canaan Project campaign, David called a family meeting. Just him and Rebecca and her 2 younger siblings, James, who was 26 and worked in banking, and Chimaka, who was 24 and was finishing her master's degree. And David said he wanted to discuss the land their father had left them. And Rebecca's siblings looked confused because the land was in Rebecca's name alone. Their father had structured it that way because Rebecca was the oldest and most financially responsible, with the understanding that she would take care of her siblings when the time came. And David knew this. But he started talking about how God had spoken to him, how the land was supposed to be used for ministry, how their father would have wanted his legacy to build a house of God. And James and Chimaka looked uncomfortable and said, "That's Rebecca's decision. It's her land legally." And David said, "But it's family land spiritually, and I think we should all pray about this together." And he prayed this long, manipulative prayer about obedience and faith and not holding on to material things when God was asking for them. And after the prayer, he looked at Rebecca and said, "What do you think, my love? Can we at least consider it?" And Rebecca said firmly, "No, David. I made a promise to my father, and that land is our security, my siblings' security. I can't just give it away." And David's face had darkened, and he said, "It's not giving it away. It's investing it in God's kingdom." But Rebecca held her ground, and David dismissed the meeting. But Rebecca could see the anger in his eyes, could feel that something had fundamentally changed between them. After that meeting, David became cold and distant. He stopped sleeping in their bedroom, claimed he was spending nights at the church, praying and fasting for the Canaan Project. He stopped eating meals with Rebecca, stopped talking to her except when necessary, and when she tried to discuss the distance between them, tried to understand what was happening, David said, "You've shown me who you really are. You're not submitted to God's will. You're not submitted to your husband's vision. You're holding on to material things instead of trusting God." And Rebecca tried to explain that it wasn't about trusting God. It was about honoring her father's wishes, about protecting her siblings' inheritance. But David wouldn't listen. And the Cold War continued for 3 months, and Rebecca felt isolated and confused, and some of the church members started treating her differently, whispering when she walked by, and she later discovered that David had been telling the church leadership that his wife was blocking God's plan, that she was being rebellious and materialistic, and slowly, carefully, David was poisoning people's perception of Rebecca. Then David changed tactics. He became sweet again, apologetic. He came home one evening with flowers and her favorite Chinese food, and he said, "I'm sorry. I've been under so much pressure with the building project. I've been taking it out on you. Please forgive me." And Rebecca, who had been lonely and hurt for months, forgave him, believed he had come to his senses, believed their marriage could heal. And for 2 weeks, David was the man she had married, attentive, loving, prayerful. And Rebecca felt hopeful, felt like they had weathered the storm. But she didn't know that David was simply changing strategy, moving from confrontation to manipulation. And he had been studying her, learning her weaknesses, planning his approach. David started inviting prominent pastors to preach at Abundant Grace, men with mega churches and television programs. and he would bring them home for dinner. And these pastors would casually mention during dinner how they had built their ministries on land that God had miraculously provided through faithful members. And they would look meaningfully at Rebekah, and David would sigh and say, "We're still believing God for our land." And the visiting pastors would pray over Rebekah, powerful prayers about breaking the spirit of mammon, about learning to let go, about the blessings that come from radical obedience. And Rebekah felt overwhelmed, felt like everyone was pressuring her, and David would hold her after these dinners and say, "I'm not pressuring you, my love. I just want you to hear from God directly. Whatever you decide, I'll support." But his actions contradicted his words, and the pressure intensified. 3.5 years into David's senior pastorship, Rebekah's mother fell seriously ill with a stroke and needed expensive medical treatment. And Rebekah used most of her savings to pay for the private hospital care and rehabilitation. And she was stressed and exhausted from working full-time, managing her mother's care, and handling church responsibilities. And David saw her vulnerability and made his move. He came to her one evening when she was particularly overwhelmed, crying about her mother's medical bills. And he held her and said, "Baby, I hate seeing you struggle like this. What if we could solve all our financial problems and build God's house at the same time?" And Rebekah looked at him warily and said, "What do you mean?" And David said, "What if we used your father's land for the church, but structured it so that you and your siblings benefit financially? The church would pay you rent, or we could arrange percentage ownership. You wouldn't lose anything. You'd gain kingdom impact and financial security." And Rebekah was so tired, so worn down, that she said, "Let me think about it." And David knew he almost had her, knew she was close to breaking. Over the next 2 months, David orchestrated a sophisticated manipulation campaign. He had the church accountant prepare projections showing how much rental income Rebekah could earn if the church leased her land. He had the church lawyer draft documents that looked protective of Rebekah's interests, but actually gave David complete control. He invited Rebekah's siblings over and convinced them that this was the best option for everyone, showed them the financial projections, told them their sister was being selfish by holding on to land while their mother needed medical care, and they all struggled financially. And James and Chimaka, who didn't understand legal documents the way Rebekah did, who trusted their brother-in-law because he was a pastor, started pressuring Rebekah too, calling her, asking why she was being stubborn, saying, "Pastor David is trying to help us. Why are you blocking this blessing?" And Rebekah felt surrounded, felt like everyone she loved was against her, and she started doubting herself, started wondering if maybe she was wrong, maybe she was holding on to the land for the wrong reasons, or maybe David was right and this was God's will. But something in Rebekah's legal mind kept nagging at her, kept telling her to be careful, to examine the documents more closely, to verify David's claims. So one night, when David was at a church meeting, Rebekah took the draft documents David had shown her and read them thoroughly. Really read them as a lawyer, not as a tired wife. And she saw immediately that the documents were fraudulent. They claimed to give her rental income and partial ownership, but the fine print gave the church, meaning David as sole trustee, complete control with no obligation to pay her anything. The rental agreement could be terminated at any time without cause, and if she signed these documents, she would lose her land completely, with no compensation, no protection, nothing. And Rebecca's hands shook as she realized what David was trying to do. Realized he was willing to destroy her financially, to steal from her and her siblings, to lie to her face, all for his building project. And she felt sick, felt betrayed in a way she had never experienced. But she also felt clarity, cold, clear anger that sharpened her mind, and she decided in that moment that she would not just refuse to sign, she would expose him, but she would do it carefully, legally, with evidence that couldn't be disputed. Rebecca went to see her former boss at the law firm, a senior partner named Mr. Brace Adeyemi, who had mentored her and who she trusted completely, and she showed him the documents David had prepared. And Mr. Adeyemi's face darkened with anger as he read them, and he said, "Rebecca, this is fraud, this is theft. Your husband is trying to steal your inheritance, using his position as a pastor to manipulate you. You need to protect yourself immediately." And Rebecca said, "I want to, but I need evidence. I need him to admit what he's doing. I need recordings, documentation, everything. Because if I just refuse to sign, he'll find another way. He'll pressure me forever. I need to end this completely." And Mr. Adeyemi nodded and said, "I know someone who can help." And he connected Rebecca with a private investigator named Chidi, who specialized in financial fraud cases. And Chidi taught Rebecca how to use recording devices, how to document conversations, how to gather evidence that would stand up in court. For the next 3 months, Rebecca played along with David's manipulation, pretended she was still considering signing the documents, but she was actually recording everything. Every conversation where David pressured her, every meeting with the church lawyer where they tried to rush her into signing, every phone call with her siblings where David had clearly coached them on what to say, and she documented everything, kept copies of all the fraudulent documents, tracked the money David was spending on himself while claiming the church had no funds. And she built a case, methodical and thorough, and when she felt she had enough evidence, when she knew she could prove not just that David had tried to defraud her, but that he had been embezzling church funds for years, buying properties in his name, using church money, living lavishly while telling members to sacrifice, she made her final move. Rebecca told David she was ready to sign, that she had prayed about it and felt peace, that she wanted to support his vision. And David was overjoyed, hugged her, cried tears that seemed genuine, called it a breakthrough, a victory for their marriage and their ministry. And he scheduled a signing ceremony in his church office, invited the church lawyer and accountant as witnesses. And on that day, Rebecca came with her handbag that contained a recording device, and she sat across from David in his office, and she let him perform his manipulation one last time. Let him quote scriptures about Abraham sacrificing Isaac, about the widow giving her last mite, about how God honors those who give sacrificially, and she watched him twist God's word to justify stealing from his wife. David pushed the documents across his desk toward Rebecca with a gold pen, his voice warm and pastoral as he said, "This is a historic moment, baby. Your obedience today will transform thousands of lives. Your father's land will become holy ground, where souls are saved and lives are changed. Generations will be blessed because of your faith." And the church lawyer, Brother Tunde, and the accountant, Sister Precious, both nodded solemnly, and Rebecca picked up the pen, her hand trembling slightly, not from fear but from controlled rage. And she said, "Before I sign, I need to understand something, David. Help me understand why the documents say the church can terminate the rental agreement at any time without cause. Why there's no binding obligation for you to pay me or my siblings anything after I transfer ownership." And David's smile faltered for just a second before he recovered and said, "Those are just legal formalities. Standard language. You know, I would never take advantage of you. You're my wife." And Rebecca said, "But legally, once I sign this, you could sell the land tomorrow and keep all the money, and I would have no recourse. Isn't that correct, Brother Tunde?" And the lawyer shifted uncomfortably and said, "Well, technically yes, but Pastor would never do that." And Rebecca nodded slowly and said, "So you're all asking me to trust that my husband won't steal from me, even though the documents are structured to allow exactly that?" And David's face hardened and he said, "Rebecca, why are you being difficult? I thought you had peace about this. I thought we had moved past your doubts." And Rebecca said, "I have moved past my doubts, David. I now have complete clarity." And she reached into her handbag, pulled out the recording device, set it on the desk, and pressed play. David's voice filled the office, a recording from 2 weeks earlier where he had told his assistant pastor, a conversation Rebecca had captured using the device hidden in David's own office. And in that recording, David said, "I've almost got her. She's ready to sign. Once that land is in my name, I'll sell it immediately. I've already got a developer offering 300 million naira. I'll tell the church the deal fell through for the church complex, and I'll pocket the difference. She'll never know, and even if she suspects something, there's nothing she can do because the documents give me complete control. I'm going to be a rich brother, finally free from depending on church offerings." And the assistant pastor's voice said, "But what about Sister Rebecca? Won't she be devastated?" And David laughed and said, "Rebecca is too emotional, too trusting. She still thinks I love her. She doesn't realize she's just been useful. The lawyer wife who helped me build credibility, who gave me access to connections and money. Once I have her land, I don't even need to stay married to her. I can divorce her and marry someone younger, prettier, someone who fits my new status." And Rebecca stopped the recording and looked at David, whose face had gone from confident to ashen. And she said, "I have 47 recordings like this, David. 47 separate instances of you admitting you're defrauding me, embezzling from the church, planning to divorce me once you steal my land. And I have documents proving you've been buying properties in your personal name using church funds. I have bank statements showing you've diverted 68 million naira meant for ministry into your private accounts. I have testimony from contractors you've defrauded, from church members you've exploited. I have everything." The room was completely silent. Brother Tunde and Sister Precious looked terrified. They had clearly known something was wrong, but had gone along with David out of fear or greed. And David stared at Rebecca with an expression she had never seen before, pure hatred mixed with panic. And he said, "You've been spying on me, recording me secretly. Do you know how illegal that is?" And Rebecca smiled coldly and said, "Actually, David, as a lawyer, I know exactly what's legal. And in Nigeria, one-party consent recordings are admissible in court, which means every recording I have where I was present or where I had reasonable suspicion of criminal activity is perfectly legal evidence. And I've already submitted copies of everything to the police, to the Corporate Affairs Commission, to the church's Board of Trustees, and to a journalist at the Punch newspaper who is very interested in stories about pastors defrauding their wives and churches." And David lunged across the desk, trying to grab the recorder, but Rebecca was faster. She stepped back and said, "That's just one copy, David. I have backups everywhere, with my lawyer, with the police, in cloud storage. You can't destroy the evidence." David slumped back in his chair, his carefully constructed image crumbling in real time. And Brother Tunde stood up and said, "Pastor, is this true? Have you been stealing from the church?" And David couldn't answer, couldn't form words, and Sister Precious started crying and said, "I didn't know. I swear I didn't know it was this bad. He told me the private accounts were for mission work." And Rebecca looked at them both and said, "You knew enough. You knew these documents were designed to cheat me. You participated willingly, and you'll both answer for that." And she pulled out her phone, showed them that she was already recording this conversation too, and said, "If either of you try to help him hide evidence, try to warn him about what's coming, I will make sure you're charged as accessories to fraud. Do you understand?" And they both nodded frantically. Rebecca turned back to David, who was sitting motionless, staring at nothing, his entire world collapsing. And she said, "Here's what's going to happen. You're going to resign as senior pastor immediately. You're going to return every naira you stole from the church. You're going to sign over all the properties you bought with church money, and you're going to confess everything publicly. And if you do all of this cooperatively, I might consider not pursuing criminal charges that would put you in prison for 15 years. And David looked up at her with desperate eyes and said, "Rebecca, please, I'm your husband. We took vows before God." Rebecca's laugh was bitter and sharp as she said, "You invoked our vows, David. Really? The same vows you were planning to break the moment you stole my land. The same vows you violated every time you lied to me, manipulated me, told church members I was rebellious and materialistic. You don't get to hide behind marriage vows or pastoral authority anymore. Those shields are gone." And David's face crumpled and he started crying. Big, dramatic tears that might have moved her 5 years ago, might have made her doubt herself and soften. But Rebecca had learned to recognize his performance, had seen him cry manipulative tears too many times, and she felt nothing but disgust. And she said, "Save your tears for the congregation. You're going to need them when you confess." And she walked out of that office with her head high, leaving Davie sitting there with the church lawyer and accountant who were already distancing themselves, already planning how to save their own careers. Within 24 hours, Rebecca's evidence hit multiple targets simultaneously. The Police Financial Crimes Unit opened an investigation into David's embezzlement. The Corporate Affairs Commission froze all church accounts pending audit. The Church Board of Trustees received a detailed report of David's fraud with supporting documentation, and the Punch newspaper published a front-page story titled "Megachurch Pastor Caught on Tape Planning to Defraud Wife of 250 million naira Inheritance." And the story included excerpts from the recordings, showed copies of the fraudulent documents, detailed the properties David had bought with church money, and the reaction was explosive. Within hours, the story was everywhere. On every blog, every social media platform, every WhatsApp group, and Abundant Grace members were calling each other in shock and rage, demanding explanations, demanding their money back, demanding David's arrest. David tried to control the narrative, called an emergency church meeting that evening, stood at the pulpit with his Bible, and attempted to preach about spiritual warfare, about how the enemy attacks men of God when they are about to experience breakthrough, about how his wife had been deceived by demons of jealousy and rebellion. But he had barely spoken for 5 minutes when members started shouting questions. Is it true you were going to steal her land? Did you really embezzle 68 million naira? Are you planning to divorce Sister Rebecca? And David's voice faltered, his confidence cracked, and then someone played the recording on their phone through a Bluetooth speaker. David's own voice, admitting everything, and the church erupted. People screaming, crying, rushing toward the altar. And the church security had to physically protect David from members who wanted to attack him. And David was escorted out of his own church through a back door, while members threw offering envelopes and hymn books at him. And that night, David Adeleke's ministry ended not with dignity, but with shame and chaos, and his own recorded voice condemning him. The police arrested David 3 days later at his house in Lekki, charged him with fraud, theft by conversion, and forgery. And because the evidence was so overwhelming, because Rebecca had documented everything so thoroughly, David's lawyers advised him to take a plea deal, confess everything, return the money, and hope for a reduced sentence. And David, who had no choice, who knew that fighting would only make things worse, agreed. And 2 months later, he stood in a Lagos High Court and admitted to defrauding his wife, embezzling from his church, and planning to steal 250 million naira worth of land. And the judge, a stern woman named Justice Okonkwo, who had zero tolerance for religious fraud, sentenced David to 7 years in prison, ordered him to repay 68 million naira to the church, and permanently banned him from operating any religious organization in Nigeria. And as David was led away in handcuffs, Rebecca sat in the courtroom gallery and felt not triumph exactly, but closure, justice, the peace that comes from fighting back and winning. Rebecca's story became national news. She was invited to speak on television programs about financial abuse in religious settings, about how pastors exploit their wives and members, about the importance of documentation and legal protection. And she became an advocate for church financial transparency, helped draft legislation requiring religious organizations to submit to audits, worked with women's rights organizations to educate wives of pastors about their legal rights, and she used her platform to help other women who were being similarly exploited. And dozens of women contacted her with their own stories of pastoral abuse, of husbands who used God's name to justify theft and manipulation. And Rebecca helped them, connected them with lawyers, taught them how to gather evidence. And slowly, gradually, the culture began to shift. Pastors became more accountable. Churches became more transparent. And Rebecca's courage inspired others to speak up, to fight back, to refuse to be victims. 3 years after David's conviction, Rebekah stood on the land her father had left her, the 15 plots in Ajah that were now worth over 400 million naira, and she broke ground on a new project, not a church, but a women's empowerment center called the Ruth Foundation, named after the biblical Ruth, who had rebuilt her life after loss. And the center would provide free legal services to women experiencing domestic abuse, would offer business training and microloans to help women achieve financial independence, would have counselors who understood religious manipulation and could help women heal from spiritual abuse. And Rebekah funded the entire project herself, used her inheritance exactly the way her father would have wanted, to build something that would help people, that would create change, that would honor his memory. On the day of the foundation's opening ceremony, Rebekah's siblings, James and Chiamaka, stood beside her. They had apologized profusely for pressuring her to sign over the land, had admitted they had been manipulated by David, hadn't understood the legal implications, and Rebekah had forgiven them because they were young and trusting, and David had been convincing. And now they worked with her at the foundation, James managing finances and Chiamaka running in the counseling programs. And together, the three of them built something beautiful on the land their father had left them, something that helped hundreds of women escape abuse, rebuild their lives, and find their voices. Rebekah never remarried. She said she was content being single, focused on her work, her foundation, her mission to protect other women from the kind of manipulation she had endured. But she didn't hate men or hate marriage. She just knew that she would never again trust blindly, never again ignore warning signs, never again let love make her vulnerable to exploitation. And she told the women who came through her foundation, love is beautiful, marriage can be wonderful, but never give anyone the power to destroy you, financially, legally, or spiritually. Keep your own accounts, keep your own property, keep your own power, because partnership should add to your life, not subtract from it. And if someone who claims to love you tries to take everything you have, that's not love, that's theft with religious decoration. 5 years after that day in David's office, when Rebekah had played the recording that destroyed him, she received a letter from prison, from David, and the letter was full of apologies, claims that he had found genuine faith in prison, that he understood now how wrong he had been, that he hoped someday she might forgive him. And Rebekah read the letter once, then burned it, because some betrayals are too deep for forgiveness. Some wounds don't heal just because the person who inflicted them says sorry. And Rebekah had moved beyond needing David's repentance. She had built a life where he was irrelevant, where his voice no longer mattered, where his manipulation had no power. And that was better than any apology could ever be. Which moment hit you the hardest? Drop a comment below with your thoughts and tell us where you're watching from. We love hearing from our viewers around the world. Your support keeps these stories coming. Thank you for watching. And remember, documentation is protection. Evidence is power. And when someone shows you who they really are, believe them and prepare accordingly. See you in the next one.